Welcome to Books and Books. Thank you so much for joining us here in the store. And for those of you watching on the internet, welcome to you as well. Very quickly, we are very happy to have with us Lee Smith this evening and her new book, Guests on Earth. But before we get into that, please pick up a copy of your Fairgoer's Guide for the Miami International Book Fair. This is the 30th anniversary, presented by the Center for Literature and Theater at Miami-Dade College. This will give you the breakdown of all the great events we have planned for the book fair. A couple of note, John Lewis, Pat Conroy, Angelica Houston, Sherman Alexie, any number of wonderful events for the book fair. And while you're doing that as well, of course, pick up a copy of the Books and Books newsletter. This will give you a breakdown of all the wonderful events we have here in the store every night of the week, a lot of which are now live streamed, as you see by the cameras. Come in. And if you can't make it to the store, you can always call the number below and get a book autograph. We'll get a book autograph for you by whoever is authoring that evening, and we'll send it to you or hold it here for you at the store, whatever is your pleasure. The insane are always mere guests on earth, eternal strangers carrying around broken decalogues that they cannot read. F. Scott Fitzgerald. Evelina Toussaint, orphan child of an exotic dancer in New Orleans, is just 13 when she is admitted to Highland Hospital in Asheville, North Carolina. The year is 1936, and the mental hospital is under the direction of the celebrated psychiatrist, Dr. Robert S. Carroll, whose innovative treatments for nervous disorders and addictions is based upon fresh air, diet, exercise, gardening, art, dance, music, theater, and therapies of the day such as rest cures, freeze wraps, and insulin shock. Talented Evelina is soon taken under the wing of the doctor's wife, a famous concert pianist, and eventually becomes the accompanist for all musical programs at the hospital, including the many dances and theatricals choreographed by longtime patient Zelda Fitzgerald. And the plot thickens. A writer at the height of her craft, Lee Smith has created through her masterful melding of fiction and fact a mesmerizing novel about a world apart, a time and place where creativity and passion, theory and medicine, fact and fiction, tragedy and transformation are luminously intertwined. She's the author of 16 previous books of fiction, including the best-selling novels Fair and Tender Ladies and The Last Girls, winner of the Southern Book Critics Circle Award. Also the recipient of the 1999 Academy Award in Fiction from the American Academy of Arts and Letters. She lives in Hillsborough, North Carolina, where I'm sure the weather is much more pleasurable than it is here. Please give your warmest welcome to Ms. Lee Smith.
Thank you. Thanks to everyone for coming, and I am so glad to be here. And I have to say, I've never been in a bookstore before with a bar in the middle of it. I think this is the best idea. This is wonderful. Well, I'm going to start by reading you a tiny little essay, actually, that I wrote about this book. One thing that has happened just in the last few years since I published my previous novel is that all this marketing is now being done on the internet. And so there are all these internet sites for books, such as Shelf Awareness and Goodreads and all these different things. And so if you publish a book, you better cooperate. And if someone wants to do an inline interview with you or wants you to write for them or anything, it's very helpful. So I was contacted by the website She Reads, which I love, and they gave me an assignment. So this is a little assignment. This is what they told me to do. The assignment is, tell me something true about your new novel, which is interesting. And so I took this very seriously, and I wrote an actual little essay for their website, and the name of my essay will be familiar to any of you who are Flannery O'Connor fans. The name of it is Everything That Rises Must Converge. Everything that rises must converge. And I think it is what I'm saying here is probably as much about writing in general, or at least my writing, as it is about this particular book. But here we go. Everything that rises must converge. This quotation from Flannery O'Connor comes to mind whenever I think about writing my new novel, Guests on Earth, or any novel, actually. For me, each novel comes from deep within my whole life. as I have lived it up to that very point. There will always be some idea, some image or emotion or experience that just won't go away, that rises to the top rather than receding in memory as the years pass. And then there will come that point when it finds its own time. So it was with Guests on Earth, though the visual image which started it all was perhaps the most dramatic that I have ever experienced. Well, let me backtrack and start by saying that, like so many other girls in other small towns all across boring small town America, I was always in love with that golden couple, the Fitzgeralds. I was in love with both of them, the brilliant novelist F. Scott Fitzgerald and his glamorous, flamboyant wife, Zelda. I read The Great Gatsby over and over again. I also read everything else I could find about them. Our first truly American celebrity couple, when you think about it. I quivered at Zelda's declaration, quote, "I want to love first and live incidentally." Well, me too, I thought. I was fascinated by Zelda's zaniness, her southernness, her frank sexuality, and utter disregard of customs and rules as they lived uproariously in hotels and rented rooms in several countries. Their gilded life turned dark, then darker, as alcoholism, infidelity, and mental illness took their toll. Though schizophrenia forced Zelda to give up her long-cherished dream of becoming a professional ballerina, she published her poetic novel, Save Me the Waltz, in 1932, 2 years after her first hospitalization. She continued to write, dance, choreograph, and paint, becoming an incredible visual artist through many hospital stays, ending up at Asheville, North Carolina's famous Highland Hospital in 1936. She died here 12 years later in the tragic and mysterious fire of March 9, 1948, one of 9 women patients who burned to death in a locked ward on the top floor of the hospital's central building, where they had been placed for their own safety because they had undergone insulin shock treatments that day. And so when they awakened, they would be very disoriented and might wander out, off, whatever. And so this ward, the top ward, was locked for their own safety, and a nurse was checking on them. But the fire which occurred that evening was one of the worst hospital fires which has ever happened in this country. And Zelda's body was identified only by her charred ballet slipper. Oddly enough, this is where Zelda's story and mine converge. Remember, I told you that the title of this is Everything That Rises Must Converge. It would turn out that both my parents suffered from mental illness, and my father was a patient at Highland Mental Hospital in the 1950s. Decades later, my son Josh spent several helpful years there in the late 1980s in both inpatient and outpatient situations as he battled schizophrenia. Though I had always loved Zelda, as I have told you, it was during these years, my many visits to see Josh in Asheville, that I became fascinated by her art and her life within that institution, and by the unsolved mystery of her awful death, because the fire was set, and this was never, this mystery was never solved. So I can tell you, I remember the exact moment when I knew that I was going to write this book. My son Josh often played piano gigs. He was a jazz piano player, even at that young age, and he often had played gigs in downtown Asheville. And this particular evening, he and I were walking up Zillicoa Avenue toward the Mountaintop Hospital during a particularly brilliant winter sunset. The entire arc of the sky shone red behind the crenellated battlements of Castle-like Homewood, like Jane Eyre, like this, one of Highland's most interesting older buildings. Of course, this red sky behind these roof lines reminded me of the dreadful fire. But I had just been reading a collection of the Fitzgerald's letters, and some of Scott's words came back to haunt me, too. Quote, "I used to wonder why they kept princesses in towers," the romantic young officer had written to his Alabama beauty, Zelda Zaire, repeating the image he was obsessed with, wanting to keep her all for himself. He had met her at the beauty ball in Montgomery when she was only 17 years old, and he was a soldier stationed at the fort right outside town, and fallen in love, and then gone back to New York to try to finish his novel and make enough money so he thought they could get married. And meanwhile, he really didn't like it that she was having about 6 dates a day with other boys there in Montgomery. So he said, "I used to wonder why they kept princesses in towers." And she had replied, "Scott, I get so damn tired of being told that. You've written that verbatim in your last 6 letters." So the notion of the imprisoned Southern princess became a part of the dramatic image of the red sunset, the fire. Okay, I thought at that very moment, okay, this is a novel, and I'm going to write it whenever I can stand it. So here it is, finally, 10 years after my son's death and 65 years after Zelda's. In it, I am proposing a solution to the mystery of the fire with a series of plausible events leading up to the tragedy and a cast of characters, both imagined and real. Is it true? Well, strictly speaking, no. But in another, deeper way, yes. I have always found that I can tell the truth better in fiction than I can in nonfiction. And this novel is as true as I can make it, containing everything I know about madness and creativity and love. In a way, I think it's really about transformation. And before I go any further, I should tell you that my son Josh did get a lot better at Highland Hospital. He came back to Chapel Hill and had a number of good years, being a sushi chef and playing jazz piano in our sushi restaurant. And so finally he died of a heart attack at 34. But this was a transformative and I think beneficial time there for him. And it reminds us, I guess, it's the original meaning of asylum is a safe place, and a place to get well. Okay, so I was forever fascinated, though, with the fire, with the mystery of the fire, and during the time I was visiting up there, I read everything available in Asheville, everything in every library, clippings, letters that people had donated to the library, everything about police reports, everything about this fire. And then 10 years pass. Well, I guess it's about 7 years pass, and I realize I really have got to go ahead and write this novel. It's the kind of thing, if something won't let you alone, you've got to do it. So I began to do even more research, and luckily the hospital had been turned over to Duke University, And all of this hospital records turned out to be right up the street from me because I lived, 5 minutes from Duke. And so I could go in and then had access to all these records too. And I began to also research who was there, who were the patients, who was sent to Highland Hospital, and what were these diagnoses, and how were they treated. And I began to get into the whole history of mental illness, and particularly how people thought about it, and how women were perceived and treated somewhat differently from men, and just all of these kinds of things. And the result of that was more and more characters begin to emerge. More and more people were sort of stepping forward from the research, and wanting to be in my novel. So it ended up being a kind of a group novel. That's why I sort of have a kind of a group name for it, because it's about a whole group of people, patients and staff, and doctors, and also people who work in the kitchen, people who work in the laundry, who are all Appalachian mountaineers from, right up the road. And so that brings in issues of class and insider, outsider, and all kinds of other things. So I just became obsessed. And so here we go. The question inevitably comes up, I think, whose novel is it finally going to be? Who's going to be the narrator? I think at first I had perhaps thought it might be Zelda. Then after reading every single thing that Zelda Fitzgerald ever wrote, I decided it couldn't possibly be Zelda for several reasons. One is because she is one of the most interesting writers and accomplished writers, stylistically, I think, in American literature. And she is she writes like nobody else except possibly Virginia Woolf, and the English writer. And I think she mixes up all her sensory imagery so that trees are singing and hours are marching and all sorts of things are happening, and everything like verb tense and common sense and chronology just fly right out the window. And so it's very exciting and would be really hard to sustain as an imitation for the entire length of a novel. And it's kind of hard on I've had students who just absolutely refuse to read her novel, Save Me the Waltz, for that same reason. It's hard. It's hard to sustain and follow in a certain way. And also, frankly, I didn't want to. I do a few. There's several letters and diary entries in here that are me imitating, her, trying to approximate her style. But frankly, I think her own husband stole enough from her, and I'm not gonna be helping in that particular pursuit. So anyway, who could be my narrator? I write better from a single person point of view. Should it be all these people? There's a lot of people. So I just couldn't, I couldn't think what to do. And so finally, I was trying to think of who might be present, who might be privy to the thoughts and feelings of a whole number of them. And I came up with my narrator, Evelina Toussaint, French name, as you can tell. She is the daughter of a courtesan, an exotic dancer from New Orleans. She's fictitious. But she's sent to Highland Hospital at the age of 13 because her mother in New Orleans has killed herself, and the powerful cotton broker, a very wealthy and august personage in New Orleans, doesn't know what to do with this child. He tries taking her into his own home. It's a disaster. So he and his wife send her off to Highland Hospital, which was the kind of place where children could live, older people could live for years at a time. Zelda Fitzgerald, for instance, was there for 13 years with only, brief forays back to Montgomery. So you could be a sort of a ward of Dr. Carroll in a way. So anyway, Evelina is a piano prodigy, and she becomes the accompanist for all these different musical events which were happening at the drop of a hat at Highland Hospital at that time, where they had theatricals, concerts, dances, programs of all sorts constantly. Dr. Carroll was the head of the hospital, and his wife was a famous concert pianist who was, aiding and abetting him in all these pursuits, which he had decided would be therapeutic. And now I think everyone agrees with him, because art therapy of all sorts, is found in every good hospital. But at that time, this was something new that he came up with. And also the idea of physical exercise. Every patient had to walk 5 miles a day if they possibly could get them out there. And also they kept up the grounds. He believed in hortotherapy, as he called it. Everyone had to help take care of the hospital grounds and raise plants in the greenhouse and all of this sort of thing. So Dr. Carroll was full of many innovations in his care. He really invented occupational therapy and felt that, it wasn't good for anybody to just sit around being crazy. You ought to do something. Why not? So this is Evelina is my narrator. She's telling the story after the events of the fire, and she introduces herself. This is her adult voice, like this. She says, "For years, I have intended to write my own impressions of Mrs. Zelda Fitzgerald. From the time I first encountered her when I was but a child, myself at Highland Hospital in Asheville, North Carolina in 1937, and then a decade later during the several months leading up to the mysterious tragedy of 1948. I bring a certain insight and new information to this horrific event that changed all our lives forever, those of us there upon that mountain at that time. This is not my story then, in the sense that Mr. Fitzgerald's The Great Gatsby was not Nick Carraway's story either. Yet Nick Carraway is the narrator, is he not? Is any story not always the narrator's story in the end? So she's my narrator. And I will give you, just read you, let's see, a little excerpt from the 3rd chapter. And you can see, I guess, where I got this particular chapter very, very quickly. This is Evelina speaking. She's only been at Highland Hospital for a few months, and she's only had one initial encounter with Mrs. Fitzgerald, which scared her to death. And now she finds herself in an art therapy class with Mrs. Fitzgerald. So this is her second encounter. The name of this chapter is Paper Dolls. And I almost named the whole novel Paper Dolls, because it would have fit in a lot of ways. Zelda was famous for her very lifelike, oversized, and weird paper dolls. I just saw a whole bunch of them in Montgomery, Alabama, where I just went for the International Fitzgerald Conference. And she was from there, and so I got to see they're amazing. Anyway, okay. This is Evelina. Finally, I found myself face to face with the woman in the black ballet slippers and tights again in the art studio at Homewood, several months after our first scary encounter. I sat at a long table, dabbling half-heartedly in watercolors, attempting a still life of the fruit which the art teacher, Miss Malone, had piled up in a bowl before us. Yellow pears, red apples, dusky grapes. Miss Malone padded from person to person with quiet words of encouragement, her thick gray braid hanging down to her hips. Meanwhile, a summer breeze blew through the studio, with its heavy leaded windows propped open, its doors ajar. I wanted only to be out of there in the swimming pool, newly filled and open, shimmering in the sunshine. Evelina's only 13, at this time. Miss Malone struck her hanging gong, the sign that the class was over. "Next time we shall paint in plein air," she announced. These French words caught me unawares, bringing me back to New Orleans, where suddenly I could see the dusty summer streets, hear the clip-clop of the horses and the buggies down by Jackson Square, taste the multicolored ices the old man sold from a cart at the corner. I bowed my head to hide my tears. "There, there," a kind voice said, and I looked up in surprise to see the fearsome Mrs. Fitzgerald, now changed entirely. She wore a loose-fitting artistic smock. Her brown hair swung to her shoulders. She looked younger and prettier than she had before. "Now let me see." She smoothed out my painting, which was terrible. "Not bad at all, though it must be boring for you, such a fuddy-duddy old assignment." It was boring, though I hadn't thought of that. Determined to be a good girl, I did everything that I was told at Highland, as I had with the nuns, questioning nothing. I loved rules. "I had a little girl, too, once upon a time," she told me gently, smiling. "A little pie-faced girl like you. She was awfully cute." "Where is she now?" Too late, I realized that perhaps I should not have asked this question. But Mrs. Fitzgerald's answer was calm. "Oh, she's away, far away, away from here, at a boarding school named Ethel Walker. She likes it there. She's better off." Her tone was wistful. Better off than what, I wondered. Others were leaving now. Miss Malone had come up to hover behind us, listening to our conversation, though she did not interrupt, according Mrs. Fitzgerald, as did the others, a kind of special respect. "I know what little girls like." She was smiling at me. "Paper dolls." Inadvertently, I clapped my hands, for I had never had any paper dolls, though I had always fancied them. "I would love that," I said sincerely, "but I'm afraid I am too old for them now." "Well, then, we shall make some very sophisticated older paper dolls for you," she said, "with very exciting lives. Look here." She hauled a leather portfolio up on the table and began pulling out big sheets of paper, all the colors of the rainbow. "Scissors," she said to Miss Malone, who produced them without a word. "Get the glue," she said to me, and I ran to do so while the studio emptied out around us. She pulled up her chair. I pulled up mine. All thought of the swimming pool vanished. Now the scissors began to flash in earnest as the silhouettes of girls, 3, 4, 5, 6, 10 girls, emerged, fluttering out onto the table. "Well, make them some clothes then," Mrs. Fitzgerald shot at me. And I did, clumsily at first, tailoring their skirts and jackets as best I could. Miss Malone appearing with bits of lace and cloth and sequins to glue on. Soon the table was filled with these girls in their rudimentary clothing, as the dapple sunlight shifted outside and the sounds of a faraway game floated in the window. "Now look," she said, folding the biggest sheet of paper just so, then snipping quickly, expertly, before pulling them out suddenly. A string of 6 girls, then 12 more after that, holding hands, dancing. I was blissfully happy. It was all the friends I had ever wanted and had never had. "But where will they all live?" I blurted out, for this was the question I worried about all the time. Where would I live once I got out of this hospital? "Draw them some houses, then," Mrs. Fitzgerald said imperiously, pushing over another of the largest sheets, and I did so. An entire street of houses, something I was very good at. Drawing houses with 2 stories, houses with 3 stories, houses with pointed windows, some with balconies, some with chimneys, some little houses with picket fences surrounding them. I drew a grand stone mansion with a crenellated roof line like Homewood, the building we were in now, and then a real castle with a similar roof line and a high tower with a flag flying from it. I cut out a piece of blue cloth for the flag and glued it onto the flagpole. Then I took up one of our paper dolls and gave her a smiling face and blue eyes and a long blue dress and a yellow crown. This took quite a while. It was by far the most detail I had yet lavished upon any of my friends. I was working so hard, concentrating so intently, that I did not at first realize that Mrs. Fitzgerald had ceased her own fierce population of our town, and sat quite still, observing me. "Now she has been chosen princess by everyone in the country," I said, gluing the crown on her head, "and now she is going to claim her kingdom." I placed her up on top of the tower, next to the flag, and drew a happy, smiling yellow sun in the sky above. "There now," I said, "ta-da!" imitating trumpets. Mrs. Fitzgerald said not a word, reaching forward in a lightning stroke to grab up my beautiful princess and crumple her into a ball, which she tossed under the table. I sat paralyzed like a paper doll myself, feeling my own blood and all my volition draining out of my body. "You have killed her," I whispered. "Don't be such a silly little pie-face," she said abruptly. "It is far better to be dead than to be a princess in a tower, for you can never get out once they put you up there. You'll see. You'll see. You must live on the earth and mix with the hoi polloi." At this, she began gathering up all our other paper dolls and crumpling them up, throwing them into the air where they were caught by the breeze and fluttered everywhere. Now, Mrs. Fitzgerald, let's save these. Perhaps your young friend and you could create a fine collage," came the reassuring voice of Miss Malone. But I did not stay to see whether this suggestion had any effect or not. I grabbed up my chains of hand-holding friends and ran for dear life out the door, heart pounding, and did not look back. Thank you. Thank you. But it's not quite as dire as all that all the time, I assure you, because as I say, I think that maybe the real I guess there's one of the images that I have here is a kaleidoscope that kept recurring, and I didn't even notice it while I was writing. And I've noticed what people have been writing about the book now. I have noticed it, and I guess that's kind of an image for me of what happens. It's it's a world apart. This hospital up on a hill, and everything within it is brightly colored, and it keeps changing. And I think transformation would be, healing, change, transformation. Would be a good description, I guess, of why that kaleidoscope keeps, why the colors keep changing. Okay, questions about anything?
Folks, we're going to come around with a microphone for the internet audience, so you won't be able to hear yourself in the store, but please speak into the microphone so they can hear you online if you have a question. Thank you.
Questions from anybody? Yes, right here in the front. Here she is, right here. Oh.
So sorry.
Here you go.
Some of the ophthalmology journals wrote about insulin therapy in the 1920s and 30s, and advances in ophthalmology in the 1920s included slit lamp microscopy, finding out more about vision. Were those kinds of studies context of your reading, either directly or through Zelda's writings?
Okay, this has to do with ophthalmology, right? Studies that were ophthalmology that had to do with the results of insulin therapy. I guess the results. Yeah. Okay, the time of the novel seems to coincide with the time of advances in vision studies and ophthalmology. I am not aware of that. I know that insulin therapy was still being used at Highland when Zelda was there. It would soon be superseded by electroshock therapy, which was much easier to pinpoint and control and deal with more definitely, because insulin shock would simply throw, a patient would be put to sleep and then insulin administered, which would induce diabetic coma. And they would be in the diabetic coma until, they gave them sugar, something, orange juice, etc., to bring them back. And this seems to be very risky to me as a method, and very hard to control because of the varying weights and ages and, so on of the people. And it was done in big groups. There would be, so, and I have several scenes in here. I got very, very specific reports on exactly how this was done, at that time. And it would be, it would be like 15, 20 patients in a big room where all this is happening at once, and the doctor's going around and checking, and then beginning to bring certain people back and not others. And I don't know how this was, I ran into, on one person that I ran into during this book tour is someone whose mother died during an insulin shock therapy treatment at Highland Hospital, and she is writing a book about that and about those particular kinds of treatments. Shock therapy, though, was about the only thing they had at that time that really affected change. Shock therapy would mean, insulin shock or electroshock would mean a whole course of treatments, say 20, every other day till that much was, and they often were effective or seemed to be effective. They did not have the kinds of drugs that we have. They did have some medication, like anesthesia or things to calm you down, make you sleep, etc. But really, what I think a lot of the healing that happened in such hospitals as Highland was just simply by the orderly regimen and the being away from your family and the situations that had maybe, been instrumental in causing an illness and so on. And so in some cases, and anyway, just that and the healthy regimen. So sometimes people did get a lot better. Yeah. Sometimes not.
You talked a little bit about your choice of narration and how you decided on
Yes.
Evelina because
Yes.
it's the single narrator. Can you talk a little bit more about that choice and about if you explored with the other characters or how you get into their heads with just using Evelina?
Evelina is a really good listener, and I think that's because she is an accompanist. I mean, that's what she does. And so I think in a way she's an accompanist to the stories, to each person's story, in the same way that she is an accompanist to all these different people as they perform and engage in the activities of the hospital. Mm-hmm.
Yes, I wondered if there were any elements of Zelda and Scott Fitzgerald's relationship that work their way somehow into your novel.
Okay, the question is, were there any elements of Zelda and Scott Fitzgerald's relationship that worked their way into the novel? Definitely, because he's a character here, too. During the time she was at Highland Hospital. Well, he died in 1940, which was 8 years before she died, and she was in Highland the whole time. But there was a big period of time when she was in that hospital and he was visiting her. And the hospital is on one mountaintop above Asheville, and the Grove Park Inn is on the adjacent mountaintop, and he would always stay in the palatial Grove Park Inn when he visited. So he is very much a character here too, and he is talked about, and she has memories, and there are flashbacks to their life together. It's really, there are a lot of people who believe that he was very detrimental to her creativity and to her life in general, that he, and it is true that, in fact, during the early days of their marriage, he did, use her life, and he did use a number of her actual stories and so on, and scenes and words, to the extent that once she was asked to write a review of one of his books, and she said it would seem that plagiarism begins at home. No, I know what she said. She said, it seems that Mr. Fitzgerald, I believe that is how he spells his name, believes that plagiarism begins at home. And so it was even more cutting. But on the other hand, at the beginning, she had been sort of flattered and complicit, in this. And they wrote things, quote, together. And it's really hard to separate out. I do think that, that she was really ill. And I don't think he kept her from becoming the artist she could have become, because I think that illness struck, as most of the, the major illnesses, bipolar and schizophrenia, do in her, 20s or, in her 20s. And so it was very hard for her to organize her thoughts, although she was a genius, I have to say, both in her writing and her, choreography, her ballet, which she started too late to have ever been a professional anyway. And, her visual art, which is extraordinary, and that's something I did not know about until I was really researching. But I think, her diagnosis was, back before they had the term schizophrenia, when she was first admitted to Highland, it was dementia precox. That was the old term for schizophrenia. Then it was schizophrenia. Medical opinion today is pretty united on the fact that it should not have been schizophrenia, that she was in all probability bipolar. She certainly did have very hard and damaging episodes of psychosis, but you can have that with either schizophrenia or bipolar. And definitely I think it was a bipolar illness, because she could come back. She could be very sick and then get a lot better and be writing amazing poetry, painting amazing pictures, where you have to have a certain kind of organization that is very hard to get back with some of these other illnesses. So, what else? Question? Yes.
Okay, Barbara Bates has taken some of your characters to the stage. I wondered if she was interested in Emolina.
Okay, this is from a neighbor of a wonderful actress in North Carolina, Barbara Bates Smith, who has performed. She made a one-woman show in particular out of one of my novels, Fair and Tender Ladies, and she's done it like almost 700 times. She started it 20 years ago, so I think she ought to be in a hospital. Myself, I don't know that she has any plans for Evelina, but this novel just came out. Yes. Here he comes.
I'm wondering if you'll talk a little bit about your theories about the fire and why it wasn't investigated, what happened there, what was the aftermath?
Well, actually, the solution, which I propose here, is pretty close to what I think the probable cause was, in that the fire was in the top floor of the central building, and the bottom floor of the central building was the kitchen. And the fire began in the kitchen and rushed up a dumbwaiter shaft, and leaping out from floor to floor to floor very rapidly. And everything was made of wood, and even the fire escapes were made of wood. And there was no sprinkler system or anything. So it was just a kind of a very swift disaster. And one of the workers in the kitchen confessed that she'd done it, but they didn't believe her. There were several reasons why they didn't believe her, but she kept confessing to just different things, and so she ended up in Broughton Mental Hospital herself. And was judged, unreliable, because a lot of times if there is something, a crime, other people will start confessing to, and apparently, but so I chose to believe her, but I have many other possibilities, many other culprits, but so I don't know. This is what I came up with, and it's as plausible, I think, as anything else. What else? So a couple of other characters who came forward from all this research. One is named Dixie, and she's a belle much as which will drive you really crazy to be a belle, I think, but much as Zelda Fitzgerald herself had been. And, you know, to be a belle in those days was to deliver yourself over entirely to this whole belle ideal and this whole social system. And where you become, you know, you're supposed to be beautiful, you're supposed to be rich, you're supposed to be well-dressed, you're supposed to have the social arts, such as maybe playing piano or doing a little watercolor, but you're not supposed to be too serious about any of these things, because what you're doing is getting a husband, and you're not supposed to get too educated either. And you can see how this kind of a system could be very damaging to certain smart women. And very, you know, in the long run, and I think this is something of Dixie's problem. So it seemed to me that a number of the women who had been sent up to Highland, especially from the Deep South, were women who just simply were not fitting in according to their husbands' or families' expectations. And Dr. Carroll was not trying to help them find themselves. He was trying to re-educate them to their role of motherhood, to their proper role of motherhood and femininity, quote. And he also did not believe in introspection. He believed in like behavior modification through these various physical techniques and cures and so on, and shock therapy, which would shake up what you thought, and maybe you could be taught something new, or something new would come into your head. So Dr. Carroll was not a Freudian, let us say, or a Jungian. He had his own theories, but a lot of times people did seem to get better at his institution, and he did become a very famous doctor of his time. What else? Any other things? Yes. Yeah, the parallel of human trafficking in the early 20th century and madness in institutions is this part of the story. Well, I think so, yes. In particular, one character in here named Jinx is a girl who was from a poorer background, a poorer family, and she was at a certain point declared by the courts oversexed and a moral imbecile, and was sent to a prison reform school named Samarkand, which was infamous in a real place in North Carolina, where she revolted and so on, and was then sent to attracted the attention of a judge who sent her to Dr. Carroll, and but she would, I think, maybe be called a sociopath today. As it was, she had been sterilized by the state, you know, at Samarkand and so on. Because remember, this was not long, it seems not long ago, the 30s and the 40s, but eugenics was being practiced, you know, for anybody who seemed inconvenient, you know, to the whole. And there was a lot of racial discrimination and sexual discrimination and so on as to who was sterilized, who was even lobotomized, as you know, because this was the age of eugenics and still of. In fact, in 1948, the Nobel Prize was given to the person who invented the lobotomy. I mean, that recently. And during the 40s, they did not practice that at Highland Hospital, I am glad to say, though there were several botched cases that were, you know, that were being worked with and so on who were there. But a true fact, which just completely blew my mind, was that in the 40s, there was a doctor named Dr. Freeman who invented the transorbital lobotomy, which is like an ice pick through the, you know, corner of your eye. It can be done very easily, for almost at home. So he made I'm serious, he made a vehicle. He outfitted this particular vehicle, which he called, with no irony involved, the lobotomobile. And I'm not making this up. And he was traveling the South going to various small hospitals and clinics where people had signed up, their relatives or whoever to have a lobotomy. So this is like Tennessee Williams' sister. Yeah, this is all true, and it was not all that long ago. And I don't know, one of my big aims in writing this book, I think, was to show, of course, that very, very real lives are lived within these illnesses and within such institutions, that there are friendships, there is change, there is growth, everything, there is transformation. Everything that happens in real life happens, within mental illness and within institutions as well. And so that was one thing I really did want to show here. And it's just been a pleasure to me to find such a trove of rich material. And there are several other people whose stories I would very much like to tell, and haven't yet gotten to. So, okay, thank you. Thanks. Okay, thank you. Mm-hmm.
Thank you, everyone, for being here. Thank you, Lee, so much for that. We do have the books for sale behind the counter, plus all Lee's backlist, if you'd like to buy some copies of that. If you're watching on the internet, call the number below. We'll get a book signed for you. We'll hold it here for you at the store, or we'll ship it to you for free. Thank you all so much for coming.